Today we will discuss about the norma basalis posterior part. Now first of all, in this diagram, the posterior part actually extends from the arbitrary or the imaginary line that is drawn from the anterior part of this foramen magnum somewhere over here. It begins from this part up to the end. Okay, this whole is the posterior part of the norma basalis. Now we will divide this also in two main parts to for our easy convenience to study, in the median part and in the lateral parts. Okay, so first of all, in the median part, okay, we have mainly four things in line wise, or we can say before backwards. Okay, first of all, we are having the foramen magnum in the median part, foramen magnum in the median part, then the external occipital crest, then the external occipital protuberance, and the knuckle lines. Okay, so in the median part, we have divided the norma basalis posterior part into two main parts, median and the lateral. In the median, we are having foramen magnum, then this external occipital crest, then external occipital protuberance, and the knuckle lines. So now first of all, the foramen magnum. It is the largest foramen of the skull and it opens upwards. It opens upwards into the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, we have mainly three types of fossa in the skull: anterior, middle, and the posterior cranial fossa. So in upward direction, it opens into the posterior cranial fossa, while in the downward direction, it opens into the, or it actually opens into the vertebral canal. It is oval in shape, as you can see. Okay, and it actually overlapped on the sides by two condylar occipital condyles, right? Two condyles known as the occipital condyles, and on its lateral side, these two. And next is the external occipital crest. This is the external occipital crest, begins at the posterior margin of the foramen magnum and ends posteriorly and over at the external occipital protuberance. This is the external occipital protuberance. Projection, it is nothing but a projection located at the posterior end of this crest. Okay, it is easily felt in the living in the midline at the point where the back of the neck becomes continuous with the scalp. So we can say that the external occipital protuberance is actually a junction between the head and the neck. Okay, from here only the head or the scalp ends and the neck begins. Now over here you can see two lines over here. This is the superior knuckle line, okay, and this is the inferior knuckle line. Okay, and they both of them curve laterally and backward, and then laterally and forward. Okay, sometimes, occasionally, some person may have highest knuckle line also above the superior knuckle. Somewhere over here, they will be having the highest knuckle line, okay, which is normally faded but present in some human beings. And if this highest knuckle line is present, okay, it will give attachment to the galea aponeurotica in spite of this superior knuckle line. Now the lateral areas. Okay, this was the median area. Now the lateral areas, it is mainly having five things. Just remember five things. That is the first of all, the condylar part of the occipital bone or the occipital condyles. Okay, then the squamous part of the occipital bone. This is the squamous part, which is actually having the knuckle line and all these parts. This is the squamous part. This is the condylar part, the squamous part. Then the jugular foramen. Jugular foramen is this one. Okay, don't get confused between the jugular foramen and the foramen lacerum. Jugular foramen, this is jugular foramen. Okay, between the occipital bone and the petrous temporal bone. This is the pink one, is the petrous temporal bone, this is the occipital bone. So between these two we are having the jugular foramen, while the foramen lacerum in the middle part, okay, we were having it in between the petrous temporal bone and the sphenoidal bone. Okay, while this jugular foramen is between the occipital bone and the petrous temporal bone. Now two more things, that is the mastoid process of the temporal bone and the styloid process of the temporal bone. So five things over here: occipital condyle, squamous part of the occipital bone, jugular foramen, mastoid process, and the styloid process. Now let's discuss about it in detail. Now first of all, the occipital condyles. They are oval in shape and situated on each side of the foramen magnum. Now the long axis of this, as you can see, the long axis directed forward and medially, as you can see. And they articulate with the superior articular facets of the atlas. Okay, if you know, we are having the first vertebral column bone is the atlas bone, right? Atlas vertebral column, atlas vertebra, right? And second is the axis. So it articulates with the first vertebra, that is the atlas, okay, and forms the Atlanto-Occipital Joint. Remember, our first vertebra is the atlas and second is the axis. Okay, but this condyle, occipital condyle, articulates with the atlas of the vertebra and forms the Atlanto-Occipital Joint. Okay, and Atlanto-Occipital Joint is a synovial joint, remember. Now next is the Hypoglossal Canal. Okay, now this is the occipital condyle. So in anterior part of this, or the superior part, we can say over here somewhere, we'll be having the hypoglossal or the anterior condylar canal. This anterior condylar canal actually is directed laterally and forwards. Okay, while posterior to this, we will be having the posterior condylar canal, or we can say the condylar canal only. So anterior will be having the hypoglossal canal, and posterior will be having the condylar canal. It is occasionally present in the floor of the condylar fossa, present behind the occipital condyles, and superiorly, remember, it opens into the sigmoid sulcus. It will open into the sigmoid sulcus. Now one more thing, remember, jugular process. Jugular process of the occipital bone lies lateral to the occipital condyle and forms the posterior boundary of the jugular foramen. This is the jugular foramen. So jugular process actually present lateral to the occipital condyle and forms the posterior boundary of the jugular foramen. Remember, jugular process from the posterior boundary of the jugular foramen. Now the squamous part of the occipital bone, this one, is actually marked by superior and the inferior knuckle lines, okay, which we discussed before, right? Now the jugular foramen. This is jugular foramen. I told you before that its posterior boundary is mainly formed by jugular process of the occipital condyles and is directed forward and medially. As you can see, directed forward and medially, and is placed at the posterior end of the petrous-occipital suture. If you remember, I told you that this jugular foramen is actually present between, or we can say it is present between this occipital bone and the petrous temporal bone. So particularly we can say that it is placed in the posterior end of the petro-occipital suture. Somewhere over here we will be having the petro-occipital suture. So posterior to this it is present. So just remember, it is present between these two bones, occipital bone and the petrous temporal bone. Right. Now at the posterior end of this foramen, somewhere over here, okay, somewhere over here we will be having the jugular fossa. What is jugular fossa? It is present at the anterior wall of the petrous temporal bone. In the anterior wall of the petrous temporal bone, as you can see, it is hollowed. Okay, a hollowed out part of the petrous temporal bone posterior to this jugular foramen is the jugular fossa. Remember, and this jugular fossa, why it is hollowed? Because it lodges mainly the superior bulb of the internal jugular vein. This part of the petrous temporal bone posterior jugular foramen is actually hollowed because of the presence of the internal jugular veins superior bulb, and this fossa is actually larger on the right side than on the left side. So remember, this is the jugular foramen. The posterior boundary of the jugular foramen actually formed by the jugular process of the lateral to the occipital bone, or sorry, occipital condyle, and this is the jugular fossa present posterior to this jugular foramen and lodges very important, there is the internal jugular veins superior bulb. Now lateral wall of the jugular fossa is pierced by a minute canal known as a mastoid canaliculus. So lateral wall of this actually pierced by one minute canal known as a mastoid canaliculus. This is the jugular foramen. Now at the medial end of the jugular foramen we will be having one notch known as the jugular notch. Okay, and near the jugular notch apex, okay, at the apex of the jugular notch we will be having an opening which actually leads to the cochlear canaliculus. Just remember, at the medial end of this we will be having one jugular notch, and that jugular notch near to that notch we will be having one opening. Okay, and that opening actually leads to the cochlear canaliculus. Now between this jugular fossa and the carotid canal we will be having one tympanic canaliculus. So at the near the jugular notch there is an opening which actually leads to the cochlear canaliculus, and between these two carotid canal and the jugular fossa we will be having one canaliculus known as the tympanic canaliculus. Now the styloid process. This is the styloid process. At the posterior end of the root of the styloid process we will be having one foramen known as the stylomastoid foramen. This is the stylomastoid foramen. Okay, now the mastoid process. This is the mastoid process, as you can see. Is a component of the mastoid part and is large conical projection. Okay, and it is directed downward and forward. It forms a lateral wall of the mastoid notch. So let's revise it once again. As you can see, this is the occipital condyles. Okay, this is occipital condyle. The anterior to this will be having the hypoglossal canal. Posterior through this will be having the condylar canal. Okay, and over here only at the lateral part of this will be having the jugular process, which actually forms the posterior wall of the jugular foramen. Now this is a jugular foramen. Okay, which is present between the occipital bone and the petrous temporal bone and is reacted forward and medially. Okay, and the posterior end of the foramen, as you can see over here, at the petrous temporal bone, we are having one hollowed part known as the jugular fossa. Okay, and here as you can see at the right one is more large than the left one, and over here at the lateral wall of the jugular fossa is actually pierced by a minute canal known as the mastoid canaliculus. Okay, and there is one jugular notch at the medial end of this jugular foramen known as jugular notch. Okay, at the medial end of this foramen. Okay, and at the near the notch we will be having an opening which leads to cochlear canaliculus, and the tympanic canaliculus actually present in between this jugular fossa and the carotid canal. Then the Styloid process, okay, whose at the root of the Styloid process will be having the stylomastoid foramen, and this is the mastoid process. Okay, now the attachment of the posterior part of the norma basalis. First of all, the margins of the foramen magnum actually give attachment to the, first of all, the anterior Atlanto-Occipital membrane anteriorly, posterior Atlanto-Occipital membrane posteriorly, and the alar ligament on the roughened medial surface of the each occipital condyle, somewhere over here, alar ligament. Now the ligamentum nucleus is actually attached to the external-occipital protuberance and the external-occipital crest. Now the rectus capitalis lateralis is actually inserted in the inferior surface of the jugular process. This is somewhere over here will be the jugular process. So in the inferior surface of the jugular process of the occipital bone, rectus capitalis lateralis. Now at the squamous part of the occipital bone, we are having the attachments of, first of all, the semispinalis capitalis and the superior oblique muscle are actually attached between the space of the superior knuckle line and the inferior knuckle line. Between these two, we are having the insertion of the semispinalis capitalis medially and the superior oblique muscle laterally. And the area below the superior knuckle line over here, okay, provides insertion medially to the rectus capitalis posterior minor and laterally to the rectus capitalis posterior major. And one more, the mastoid notch. This is the mastoid process. So at the north of mastoid process, we are having the origin of the posterior belly of digastric. Now the structure passing through the foramen of the posterior part of the norma basalis. First for the foramen magnum. The structure passing through this is very important. First of all, we divide this into main three parts. That is the anterior narrow part, wider posterior part, and the subarachnoid space. What is subarachnoid space? It is the space between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater. So first of all, the narrow anterior part. Now this actually passes three things: apical ligament of Dens, vertical band of cruciate ligament, and the membrana tectoria. So the wider posterior part, lowest part of the medulla oblongata and the three meninges, and the subarachnoid space actually give passage to the, first of all, spinal accessory nerves, vertebral artery, sympathetic plexus around the vertebral artery, and two spinal arteries, that is the anterior and the posterior spinal arteries. So this is the foramen magnum. Now next is the hypoglossal canal. It is present anterior to this occipital condyle. Okay, so it gives passage to the hypoglossal nerve, meningeal branch of the hypoglossal nerve, meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery, and the emissary vein. Now this emissary vein actually connect the sigmoid sinus with the internal jugular vein. Now the condylar canal, which is actually present posterior to the occipital condyles. Now it gives passage to the emissary vein, which actually connects the sigmoid sinus with the suboccipital venous plexus. Over here, this was connecting the sigmoid sinus with the internal jugular vein, and this connects the sigmoid sinus with the suboccipital venous plexus. It is the mastoid canaliculus, also known as the Arnold's canal. Now the mastoid canaliculus, if you remember, it is present lateral to the jugular fossa. Somewhere over here it will be present lateral to jugular fossa. Okay, now it mainly passes the auricular branch of the vagus nerve or the Arnold's nerve. Now this nerve actually passes to from the bone and then passes to the facial canal and then emerges at the tympanomastoid fissure between the tympanic plate and the mastoid process or the mastoid part of the temporal bone, right? But if you know that these two bones or these two parts of temporal bone, that is the mastoid part or the mastoid process, and the tympanic plate actually develops after the birth. So the nerve is actually extracranial at the birth, okay, but becomes surrounded by the bone as the tympanic plate and the mastoid process develop after the birth. So during the birth, this nerve is actually extracranial, but after the birth it is surrounded by the tympanic plate and the mastoid process and the tympanomastoid fissure, and that's why this nerve is also known as the Alderman's nerve. Now tympanic canaliculus, this is actually present between the jugular fossa and the carotid canal, and this mainly transmits the tympanic branch of glossopharyngeal nerve, also known as the Jacobson nerve, to the middle ear cavity. Now the stylomastoid foramen, it is present at the posterior part of the root of the styloid process and mainly passes or transmit the facial nerve and the stylomastoid branch of the posterior auricular artery. Facial nerve and stylomastoid branch of the posterior auricular artery. Now last is the jugular foramen. Okay, this is very important. Now first of all, it has we will divide it into main three parts, that is to the anterior part, to the middle part, and to the posterior part. Now from the anterior part, as you can see, we are having mainly two things, that is the inferior petrosal sinus and the meningeal branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery in the anterior part. Remember these two. Now the middle part will be having 9th, 10th and 11th cranial nerves. And through the posterior part, as you can see, we will be having the internal jugular vein, junction of the sigmoid sinus with the internal jugular vein, this thing, and the meningeal branch of the occipital artery, and some of the emissary vein also, as you can see, but mainly these two, meningeal branch of the occipital artery and the internal jugular vein and sigmoid sinus. So this was all about the posterior part of the norma basalis view of the skull. This was my anterior and the middle part of the norma basalis, also to understand the full norma basalis of the skull well. Hope you understood well. Thank you so much.